The Broken Arrow Ranch sits 40 miles outside Tucson, where the desert wind carries the sound of splintering wood and men's screams. For 3 months, Thunder, a 17-hand black stallion, has sent 12 professional trainers to the hospital. The horse destroys everything in his path, fences, stalls, and the confidence of anyone foolish enough to approach him. Ranch owner Jake Morrison is facing bankruptcy, with his insurance company threatening to pull coverage unless Thunder is controlled or put down. Then Scarlett "Scar" Rodriguez rolls up on her Harley, leather jacket bearing the faded Hell's Angels patch she earned in a life she left behind. Most people see a tattooed ex-gang member with a criminal record. They don't know she spent her childhood whispering to wild mustangs in the Nevada mountains, or that she could break horses before she could ride a motorcycle. As she approaches Thunder's destroyed paddock, the massive stallion stops his rampage and locks eyes with her. For the first time in months, the ranch falls silent. But can Scar's forgotten gift overcome Thunder's rage, or is there something darker driving this horse to violence? The silence stretches between woman and beast like a taut wire. Scar's boots crunch on scattered splinters of what used to be oak fencing, each step deliberate and measured. Behind her, she hears Jake Morrison's labored breathing, the wheeze of a man who's aged 5 years and 3 months. The other ranch hands maintain their distance, clustered near the main barn like sheep afraid of wolves. Thunder's nostrils flare wide, steam rising from his midnight coat despite the desert heat. His muscles ripple beneath scarred hide, evidence of his battles against rope, chain, and human will. Most horses would be broken by now, reduced to trembling shells. This one burns brighter with each failed attempt to tame him. "Jesus Christ!" Jake mutters behind her, voice cracked like old leather. "Look at the size of him." Scar doesn't look away from the stallion's eyes. They're deeper than black coffee, holding intelligence that most people mistake for madness. She's seen that look before, in her own reflection during the worst years, when rage was the only thing keeping her alive on the streets of Oakland. "How'd you come by him?" she asks, her voice barely above a whisper. Bureau of Land Management auction 6 months ago, was supposed to be already broke, trained for ranch work. Jake spits into the dust. "Seller disappeared the day after I signed the papers. No forwarding address, no nothing." The stallion's ears twitch forward at Scar's voice. A good sign. Most horses this far gone stop listening altogether, lost in their own fury. But Thunder tilts his massive head, studying her with the curiosity of a predator sizing up potential prey. What happened to his previous owners? Dead. Car accident, they said. Found Thunder half-starved in a box canyon, wild as the day he was born. Jake's voice carries the weight of a man watching his life's work crumble. "Insurance adjuster comes by tomorrow morning. If I can't show progress..." The unfinished threat hangs in the air like vultures circling carrion. Scar takes another step forward. Thunder's muscles coil, ready to explode into violence, but something in her posture makes him pause. She moves like water, fluid and unthreatening, hands loose at her sides. The tattoos covering her arms tell stories of a violent past. Prison ink mixed with professional work, skulls and roses intertwined with barbed wire. "Easy, big man," she murmurs, the words carrying an authority that comes from somewhere deeper than training. "Nobody's gonna hurt you here." Thunder snorts, a sound like controlled thunder. His hooves, each the size of dinner plates, shift in the sand. Behind Scar, one of the ranch hands whispers a prayer in Spanish. "Ma'am," Jake says carefully, "maybe you should step back. That animal's killed 2 dogs and put my best trainer in a coma. He's not right in the head." Scar's laugh is low and bitter. "Neither am I, cowboy. Maybe that's what it takes." She remembers being 12 years old in the Nevada wilderness, approaching her first Mustang with nothing but patience and pocket carrots. Her grandfather's voice echoes across the years. "Sometimes the broken ones just need someone who speaks their language, Mia." Thunder takes a step toward her, then another. The massive stallion moves like liquid shadow, each movement controlled despite the destruction surrounding him. Scar can see intelligence in those dark eyes, calculating and aware. This isn't mindless violence, it's purposeful rage. "What do you want, boy?" she whispers, close enough now to see the individual scars crisscrossing his hide. "What are you trying to tell us?" The desert wind picks up, swirling dust devils between them. In the distance, a hawk screams its hunting cry. Thunder's ears flick toward the sound, and for just a moment his guard drops. Scar sees something she recognizes, the bone-deep exhaustion of fighting a war you can't win. "I know that feeling," she tells him softly. "Been there myself." Thunder's next step brings him within arm's reach. One wrong move and those hooves could crush her skull like an eggshell. Instead, he lowers his great head and breathes across her outstretched palm. The dust hadn't settled from Diablo's latest rampage when Margaret Holloway found herself staring at a name she'd hoped never to see again. Her fingers trembled as she held the yellowed business card, its edges worn from years tucked away in the back of her desk drawer. The ink had faded, but the name remained legible: Jake Cordero, horse whisperer. She'd sworn she'd never call him. Not after what happened in Amarillo. Not after the scandal that drove him from respectable ranching circles and into the shadows of the territory. But as she surveyed the destruction outside her window, broken fence posts scattered like matchsticks, her prize mare limping toward the barn with fresh cuts along her flanks, Margaret realized she was out of options. 3 trainers had tried and failed to break Diablo. The first, a renowned horseman from San Antonio, had lasted exactly 4 minutes in the corral before the black stallion launched him clean over the fence. The second, a cocky young cowboy who claimed he'd never met a horse he couldn't handle, had emerged unconscious and didn't wake up for 6 hours. The third trainer, a weathered old-timer with 40 years of experience, had taken one look at Diablo's wild eyes and walked away without even entering the pen. "That ain't no horse," he'd muttered, collecting his fee without attempting the job. "That's pure lightning with hooves." Margaret knew she couldn't afford another trainer, and even if she could, word was spreading fast across Texas. Diablo's reputation was becoming legend, and no respectable horse trainer would risk their livelihood or their life on what many were calling an impossible task. She walked to the window and watched her remaining hands give the stallion's corral a wide berth as they went about their evening chores. Even from 100 yards away, Diablo's presence dominated the ranch. The magnificent black horse stood motionless in the center of his pen, but there was nothing peaceful about his stillness. He radiated coiled energy like a thunderstorm waiting to break. The setting sun painted his coat the color of midnight oil, every muscle defined beneath his sleek hide. His mane flowed like dark water when he turned his head, and those eyes, Lord, those eyes, burned with an intelligence that seemed almost human. He wasn't just wild, he was calculating, dangerous in a way that went beyond mere animal instinct. Margaret's foreman, Hank Morrison, knocked on the study door and entered without waiting for permission. He'd been with the Holloway Ranch for 15 years and had earned that privilege, though tonight his usual confidence was noticeably absent. "Ma'am, I hate to say it, but maybe it's time to consider other options." Hank removed his hat and twisted it in his weathered hands. "That stallion's not getting any gentler, and he's spooking the other horses something fierce. Hell, he's spooking the men too. What are you suggesting, Hank?" The foreman's jaw worked silently for a moment before he found his voice. "Well, there's always the rifle option. Put him down before he hurts someone real bad." Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. The thought had crossed her mind more than once over the past weeks, but she couldn't bring herself to destroy something so magnificent, so utterly alive. Besides, Diablo represented more than just another horse. He was her last hope of saving the ranch. Her late husband's gambling debts had left the Holloway Ranch teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. The only thing standing between her and foreclosure was the promise of that stallion's bloodline. If she could break him, breed him, his offspring would be worth a fortune. Wild mustangs with his size and strength were increasingly rare, and wealthy buyers from back east would pay premium prices for horses with genuine frontier spirit. But first, someone had to survive long enough to put a saddle on him. "Give me another week, Hank." Margaret's voice carried more confidence than she felt. "I might have one more option." After the foreman left, Margaret sat alone in her study as darkness claimed the ranch. Through the open window she could hear Diablo moving restlessly in his corral, his hooves striking the earth like distant thunder. Occasionally he would release a wild cry that sent shivers down her spine, not the gentle whinny of a domestic horse, but something primal and untamed. She lit the oil lamp on her desk and pulled out a piece of her finest stationery. The letter would have to be carefully worded. Jake Cordero was proud, stubborn, and had every reason to refuse her request. But he was also the only man she'd ever seen who could look into a wild horse's soul and somehow find common ground. As her pen touched the paper, Margaret wondered if she was making a deal with the devil himself. But as another of Diablo's cries split the night air, she realized she might not have any other choice. The dust cloud appeared on the horizon just after noon, a thin brown line wavering in the heat like a mirage. Sarah Whitman stood on the ranch house porch, one hand shading her eyes, the other gripping the wooden railing so tight her knuckles had gone white. She'd been watching that same stretch of road for 3 days, ever since she'd made the phone call that might save her ranch or destroy what little reputation she had left. Behind her, the screen door creaked open and her foreman Jake stepped out, his boots heavy on the weathered planks. "That him? Has to be." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Nobody else fool enough to come out here anymore." The approaching vehicle resolved itself into a battered pickup truck. Its once blue paint faded to the color of old denim. It moved neither fast nor slow, just steady, like whoever was driving had all the time in the world and nowhere else to be. Sarah found herself studying that truck, trying to read something in its approach that might tell her whether she'd made the right choice or the worst mistake of her life. "You sure about this, boss?" Jake's weathered face was creased with worry lines that had deepened considerably over the past month. "Man's got a reputation." "So does Diablo." Sarah nodded toward the far pasture where the black stallion stood like a dark statue against the golden grass. Even at this distance the horse commanded attention, his head high and alert, as if he knew something was coming. Regular methods haven't worked. Hell, they haven't even come close. The truck turned through the ranch gates, past the sign that read Whitman Quarter Horses in letters that needed repainting. Sarah watched it navigate the dusty drive, noting how the driver took his time, probably taking in the layout of the place. The corrals, the barn, the various outbuildings, and most importantly, the pasture where 2,000 pounds of untamed fury waited. Jake spat into the dirt. "Heard tell he spent 5 years in Huntsville. I heard 10. Sarah kept her eyes on the approaching truck. Also heard he never met a horse he couldn't gentle. That was before, maybe. She straightened her shoulders, but desperate times and all that. The truck pulled to a stop in the circular drive, its engine ticking as it cooled. Through the dusty windshield, Sarah could make out a shadowy figure, but he didn't get out immediately. Instead, he sat there for a long moment, and she had the distinct impression he was studying her just as intently as she was trying to study him. From the far pasture came a sound that made both Sarah and Jake turn, a wild, piercing neigh that seemed to challenge the very sky. Diablo had begun to move, his powerful legs carrying him in a wide circle around his enclosure, his black mane streaming like a battle flag. The stallion had been calm all morning, but somehow he sensed the change in the air. "Even the horse knows," Jake muttered. The truck door finally opened with a rusty squeal, and a man unfolded himself from the driver's seat. Sarah's first thought was that he looked older than she'd expected, though it was hard to tell exactly how much of that came from years and how much from hard living. He was tall and lean, wearing faded jeans and a shirt that might have been white once upon a time. His dark hair was longer than fashion dictated, and when he turned toward the porch, she caught sight of a scar that ran from his left temple down to his jaw. But it was his eyes that made her breath catch, pale blue and watchful, like a wolf sizing up new territory. They swept over the ranch with professional interest before settling on her face. Mrs. Whitman. His voice carried easily across the distance between them, rough-edged but not unpleasant. Colt Brennan, appreciate you calling. Sarah descended the porch steps, Jake falling into step beside her like a bodyguard. Mr. Brennan, thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Been a while since I had a proper challenge. Another wild cry echoed from the pasture, longer this time and filled with what sounded almost like rage. Brennan's head turned toward the sound, and Sarah saw something shift in his expression, a sharpening of attention, like a hunter catching scent of his quarry. That him? That's Diablo. Sarah found herself following his gaze, 5 years old, unbroken and meaner than original sin. Hurt 3 men so far, one of them permanently. Brennan nodded slowly, still watching the distant horse. What's your timeline? Fast as possible. I've got a buyer coming next month, but only if the horse is broke to saddle. If not, she let the sentence hang. If not, you lose the ranch. It wasn't a question, and Sarah didn't treat it like one. That obvious? Usually is. Brennan finally looked back at her. I'll need to see him up close first, tonight when the light's soft. Horses show their true nature better in the evening. The dust hadn't even settled from Jake's demonstration when Marcus Thornfield was already reaching for his checkbook. The way the stranger had handled that bucking bronco, calm, controlled, almost supernatural, told him everything he needed to know. This man might actually be able to do what dozens of expert trainers had failed to accomplish. Name your price, Marcus said, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he wrote. Whatever it takes to break that devil horse. Jake studied the older man's face, noting the deep lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes, the way his shoulders sagged under an invisible weight. This wasn't just about money or pride. This was about survival. The ranch was hemorrhaging cash, and everyone knew it. It's not about the money, Jake replied quietly. But I'll need complete control. No interference, no second guessing. And if your hands have a problem taking orders from someone with my reputation, they can find work elsewhere. Marcus nodded without hesitation. Done. When do you start? Already started. Jake turned and walked toward the corral where Diablo waited, his massive black form moving restlessly in the confined space. The stallion's ears flicked forward at Jake's approach, and for a moment their eyes met through the wooden rails. Something passed between them, a recognition perhaps, or a challenge accepted. Jesus, whispered one of the ranch hands. Look at the size of that son of a bitch. Diablo stood 17 hands high, his coat so black it seemed to absorb the afternoon sunlight. Scars crisscrossed his hide, evidence of his battles with fences, ropes, and men. His eyes held an intelligence that bordered on human, along with a rage that had grown with each failed attempt to break him. Jake circled the corral slowly, never taking his eyes off the horse. Diablo tracked his movement, head high, nostrils flaring. When Jake reached the gate, he paused with his hand on the latch. You might want to step back, he called over his shoulder to the small crowd that had gathered. You're going in there? Marcus asked, incredulous. Just like that? No rope? No equipment? Equipment's just something else to break, Jake said. And this horse has broken plenty already. The gate swung open with a metallic creak that seemed to echo across the entire ranch. Diablo's head snapped up, his body coiling like a loaded spring. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then Jake stepped inside and quietly closed the gate behind him. The stallion exploded into motion, charging straight at the intruder with murder in his eyes. Jake stood perfectly still until the last possible second, then stepped aside with fluid grace. Diablo thundered past, wheeled around, and charged again. This time Jake didn't move at all. The horse pulled up short, hooves sliding in the dirt, his massive head just inches from Jake's chest. They stood like that for what felt like an eternity, man and beast, both perfectly still, neither backing down. Easy, Jake murmured, his voice barely audible. Easy, boy. Diablo's ears twitched. He reared up on his hind legs, pawing the air above Jake's head, but Jake remained motionless. When the stallion came down, Jake was still there, still calm, still speaking in that low, hypnotic voice. "I know what they did to you," Jake continued. His words carried on the evening breeze. "I know about the whips and the ropes and the breaking pole. I know about the fear." Something shifted in Diablo's eyes. The rage was still there, but underneath it, Jake glimpsed something else. Pain, confusion, and beneath it all, a desperate longing for understanding. The horse took a step back, then another. His breathing was labored, steam rising from his sweat-dampened hide in the cooling air. Jake matched his movements, maintaining the distance between them, never advancing, never retreating. "That's it," Jake said. "You call the shots here. Nobody's going to force you to do anything." From outside the corral, the ranch hands watched in stunned silence. They'd seen Diablo tear apart a breaking pen, watched him send 3 professional trainers to the hospital, witnessed him clear a 6-foot fence like it was nothing. Now he was standing quietly, actually listening to this stranger's voice. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Jake moved to the center of the corral and sat down cross-legged in the dirt. Diablo watched him warily, uncertain about this new development. No human had ever made himself vulnerable like this in the stallion's presence. Minutes passed. Then, with cautious steps, Diablo began to move closer. Not close enough to touch, but closer than he'd allowed any human to get without violence. Jake continued talking, sharing stories of his own past, his own demons, speaking to the horse as if he were an old friend. As darkness settled over the ranch, man and horse remained in the corral together, 2 broken spirits beginning the slow, dangerous dance of trust. The morning air carried the scent of sagebrush and horse sweat as Jake walked toward the main corral, his boots crunching against the frost-covered ground. He'd been at the Double R Ranch for 3 days now, and each morning brought the same ritual, watching Diablo from a distance, studying the stallion's movements, learning his patterns. The horse was magnificent in his fury, 16 hands of pure muscle and rebellion, his coal-black coat gleaming like polished obsidian in the early light. "You're wasting your time," called out Chuck, one of the ranch hands, as he leaned against the fence post. "That devil ain't gonna let nobody near him. We've been feeding him by throwing hay over the fence like he's some kind of wild animal." Jake said nothing, his gray eyes fixed on the stallion. Diablo stood at the far end of the corral, head high, nostrils flaring as he tested the wind. The horse's intelligence was evident in every movement, the way he positioned himself to see all approaches, how he never turned his back completely to the gate, the calculated distance he maintained from any human presence. "Lost 3 good men to that beast," Chuck continued, apparently determined to fill the silence. Billy Martinez lasted all of 10 seconds before Diablo sent him flying over the rails. Broke 2 ribs and his collarbone. Doc said he was lucky to keep his skull in one piece. Jake had heard the stories. 5 trainers in 6 months, each one leaving either injured or defeated. The last one, supposedly the best bronc buster in 3 states, had taken one look at Diablo in action and walked away without even entering the corral. But Jake had seen broken horses before, horses that had been pushed past their breaking point by men who mistook force for strength. "Mr. Cordell wants to see you," Sarah's voice came from behind him. Jake turned to find Thomas Cordell's daughter approaching, her auburn hair catching the morning sun. She'd been watching him these past few days, he'd noticed, though she kept her distance. There was something in her green eyes that reminded him of Diablo, a wariness born of experience. "He's in the office," she added, falling into step beside him as they walked toward the main house. The ranch office smelled of leather and tobacco, its walls lined with photographs of prize bulls and champion horses from better days. Thomas Cordell sat behind an oak desk that had seen decades of use, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee cup. "Sit," Cordell said, gesturing to a chair. "I'll be straight with you, McKenna. I'm starting to wonder if I made a mistake bringing you here. That horse has been on my property for near 2 weeks now, eating my hay and costing me money, and all you've done is stand around watching." Jake leaned back in the chair, his expression unchanged. "You want me to go charging in there like the others? End up in the dirt with a few broken bones to show for it?" "I want results," Cordell snapped. "Every day that horse goes unbroken is another day closer to me losing this ranch. The bank ain't gonna wait forever, and that stallion represents more money than this place has seen in years, if he can be trained. And if he can't?" Cordell's jaw tightened. "Then I'll put a bullet in him and be done with it." The words hung in the air like smoke. Jake had expected this conversation, had seen it coming in the increasing tension around the ranch, the worried glances between the hands, the way Cordell's daughter looked at Diablo with something approaching desperation. "Give me 2 more days," Jake said finally. 2 days. What's going to change in 2 days that hasn't changed in 3? Jake stood, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "That horse isn't broken, Cordell. He's angry. There's a difference. Angry horses can be reached, broken ones." He shrugged. "Well, you'd have shot him already if he was broken." Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying with it the promise of storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Jake walked back toward the corral, aware that Sarah was following him again. This time, she didn't maintain her usual distance. "Do you really think you can train him?" she asked. Jake paused at the fence, watching as Diablo paced the far side of the enclosure. The stallion's ears swiveled toward them, tracking their voices even as he maintained his vigilant distance. "Your father thinks this is about breaking a horse," Jake said quietly. "But sometimes the horse isn't the one that needs breaking." Sarah frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Instead of answering, Jake pulled a length of rope from the fence post and began working it between his hands, his movements slow and rhythmic. For the first time since his arrival, he opened the corral gate and stepped inside. Diablo's head shot up, his entire body coiling like a spring, but Jake made no move toward the horse. Instead, he sat down in the dirt, cross-legged, and continued working the rope. The stallion snorted, pawing the ground, but he didn't charge. The morning air carried the scent of dust and desperation as Jake approached the corral where Diablo waited. Word had spread through the ranch like wildfire about the stranger who'd arrived in the night, and curious eyes watched from every window and fence post. Jake could feel their stares boring into his back, but he'd learned long ago to block out everything except the task at hand. Diablo stood at the far end of the enclosure, his massive frame silhouetted against the rising sun. The stallion's coat gleamed like polished obsidian, muscles rippling beneath the surface as he paced restlessly. When Jake's boots hit the dirt near the fence, those wild eyes locked onto him with an intensity that would have sent most men running. "You sure about this, mister?" called out Tommy, the young ranch hand who'd been tasked with fetching Jake at dawn. His voice cracked with nervous energy. Jake didn't answer. Instead, he climbed the fence rails with practiced ease and dropped into the corral. The moment his feet touched the ground, Diablo's ears flattened against his skull, and a low rumble emanated from deep within the horse's chest. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. He kept his movements slow and deliberate, never breaking eye contact with the stallion. "I know what you're thinking. Another human coming to break you, another fight." Diablo snorted and pawed the ground, kicking up clouds of dust. The horse's nostrils flared as he caught Jake's scent, trying to read this new threat. Jake could see the intelligence burning behind those dark eyes, could almost feel the animal calculating distances and escape routes. For 20 minutes they stood in silent standoff. Jake remained perfectly still while Diablo circled him at a distance, never coming closer than 30 feet, but never retreating to the far end of the corral either. It was a dance as old as time, predator and prey trying to determine which was which. Margaret Calloway watched from the ranch house porch, her coffee growing cold in her hands. She'd seen a dozen trainers attempt this same approach, all of them ending up either trampled or thrown over the fence. But something about Jake's stillness was different. He wasn't trying to assert dominance or project authority. He was simply waiting. "What's he doing out there?" Frank muttered, joining his mother on the porch. Looks like a damn statue. Patience, Margaret replied, though she wasn't entirely sure herself. Sometimes that's all it takes. In the corral, Jake had begun to move, not toward Diablo, but in a slow, meandering pattern that seemed to have no purpose. He kept his shoulders relaxed, his hands loose at his sides. To the untrained eye, it looked like aimless wandering. But Jake was speaking a language older than words, the language of body movement and spatial respect. Diablo's ears pricked forward slightly. The stallion had stopped his defensive circling and was now watching Jake's seemingly random movements with growing curiosity. When Jake paused near the water trough, Diablo took 3 steps closer. When Jake crouched to examine something in the dirt, the horse's head tilted with interest. The breakthrough came when Jake sat down completely, cross-legged in the dust like he had all the time in the world. It was such an unexpected gesture of vulnerability that Diablo's entire posture shifted. The defensive tension in the stallion's frame eased slightly, and for the first time since Jake had entered the corral, the horse looked more curious than hostile. Minutes stretched into an hour. Jake remained seated while Diablo gradually closed the distance between them. 20 feet became 15, then 10. The gathered ranch hands held their collective breath as the notorious stallion approached within striking distance of the motionless man. Jake's peripheral vision caught the subtle shift in Diablo's weight distribution, the telltale sign that the horse was considering a charge. But instead of tensing or preparing to dodge, Jake did something that defied every instinct of self-preservation. He closed his eyes and tilted his head back slightly, exposing his throat to the animal that had hospitalized 3 men in the past month. Diablo froze mid-step. This wasn't the behavior of any human he'd encountered before. Every trainer, every cowboy, every supposed expert had approached him with aggression barely contained beneath a veneer of professional calm. But this stranger was offering complete surrender, complete trust. The stallion's breathing slowed. Step by cautious step, he approached the seated figure until his massive head hung directly over Jake's upturned face. One wrong move, one sudden sound, and those powerful hooves could end everything in an instant. Jake felt the horse's warm breath on his skin, caught the earthy scent of the animal's coat. Slowly, without opening his eyes, he began to hum, a low, wordless melody his grandmother had sung to calm spooked horses back in Oklahoma. The tune drifted across the silent ranch like a prayer, carrying with it the weight of old memories and older wisdom. For the first time in months, Diablo stood perfectly still. The first light of dawn painted the horizon in shades of amber and rose as Jake made his way to the corral. His boots crunched softly against the frost-covered ground, each step deliberate and measured. He'd been awake since 3, sitting on the porch and listening to the night sounds fade into morning, the distant howl of coyotes, the rustle of wind through the cottonwoods, and beneath it all, the restless movement of Diablo in his pen. Sarah was already there when he arrived, leaning against the fence with 2 steaming cups of coffee in her hands. She extended one toward him without a word, and he accepted it gratefully, wrapping his fingers around the warm ceramic. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "Sleep's overrated," Jake replied, though the truth was he'd spent the dark hours wrestling with memories he'd rather forget. The scars on his back had ached in the night, a phantom reminder of why he'd sworn off breaking horses after that last disastrous job in Nevada. The horse that had nearly killed him hadn't been half as dangerous as the black stallion pacing 30 yards away. Diablo stood in the center of his enclosure like a monarch surveying his domain. Even in the dim morning light, his coat gleamed with an almost supernatural sheen. The horse's head was raised high, nostrils flaring as he caught their scent. There was something in those dark eyes that went beyond mere wildness, an intelligence that seemed to calculate and judge everything around him. "Tell me about the first time you saw him," Jake said, taking a sip of the bitter coffee. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the stallion. "It was 3 years ago. We'd been tracking a small herd that had been raiding our water sources during the drought. Found them in Devil's Canyon, maybe 15 horses total. The moment I laid eyes on him, I knew he was different. He wasn't just leading that herd. He was commanding them. What made you think you could capture him? A rueful smile crossed her face. Pride, maybe. Stupidity, definitely. My father always said there wasn't a horse alive that couldn't be gentled with patience and understanding. Took me 6 months and half a dozen injured cowboys to realize Diablo might be the exception. Jake studied the horse's movements, noting how he favored his left front hoof slightly, an old injury, probably from fighting. The other trainers who tried, what did they do wrong? Everything! Sarah's voice carried a bitter edge. Henderson tried to break him with force, figured if he could tire him out enough he'd give in. Spent 2 weeks running him in circles until Diablo kicked down half the fence and put Henderson in the hospital. Martinez thought he could win him over with kindness, brought him apples and sugar cubes every day for a month. Diablo took the treats, then bit off the tip of his finger. And the others? Peterson tried hobbling him, figured if he couldn't move freely, he'd learn to accept human touch. Diablo waited until Peterson got close enough, then somehow managed to strike him down even with his legs tied. The man's lucky to be walking. Sarah shook her head. Each one thought they knew better than the last. Each one underestimated what they were dealing with. Jake drained his coffee and handed the cup back to her. What makes you think I'll be any different? The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Sarah turned to face him fully, and he could see the desperation she'd been trying to hide behind her tough exterior. Because you're like him, she said simply. You've got the same look in your eyes, like you've seen things that changed you, things that made you dangerous. The difference is, you chose to walk away from whatever darkness was chasing you. Maybe you can teach him to do the same. Jake felt something twist in his chest. The comparison cut deeper than he'd expected, probably because it held more truth than he cared to admit. He'd spent the last 5 years running from his past, taking odd jobs and avoiding anything that might wake up the violence he'd worked so hard to bury. There's something else, Sarah continued. Last night, after you left, I came out here to check on him. He was standing right there at the fence, staring in the direction you'd gone. I've never seen him do that before. It's like he knows you're different too. Jake looked toward the corral where Diablo had stopped his restless pacing and was indeed watching them. Their eyes met across the distance, and Jake felt the familiar chill that came with recognizing a kindred spirit. The horse wasn't just wild, he was wounded, dangerous in the way that only broken things could be. All right, Jake said quietly. Let's see what he's really made of. The morning air carried the scent of sage and leather as Maya approached the corral with deliberate steps. Word had spread through the ranch hands overnight about her encounter with Diablo, and she could feel their eyes tracking her movement from the bunkhouse windows. Some watched with curiosity, others with barely concealed skepticism. She'd spent the night studying the stallion from her cabin window, noting how he moved in the moonlight. Restless, powerful, but not without purpose. Every circuit around his enclosure followed the same pattern. Every pause at the fence occurred at precise intervals. There was intelligence behind those dark eyes, and intelligence could be reasoned with. Frank emerged from the main house, his weathered face etched with concern. You sure about this, Maya? Doc Henderson said that horse put 2 men in the hospital last month. Maya adjusted the coiled rope at her hip. Feeling its familiar weight, those men tried to break him. I'm not here to break anything. The distinction seemed lost on Frank, but he nodded anyway. Behind him, Elena stepped onto the porch, coffee mug in hand. Their eyes met across the yard, and Maya caught something unexpected in the older woman's expression. Not doubt, but a kind of fierce hope that made her chest tighten. What's your plan? Frank asked, falling into step beside her. Same as it's always been. Listen first, speak second. They reached the corral where Diablo stood at the far end, his massive frame silhouetted against the rising sun. The stallion's head turned toward them, ears forward, nostrils flaring. Maya could see the calculations running behind his eyes, measuring distances and threats. She placed her hand on the top rail of the fence. Everyone needs to back up. At least 50 feet. Maya, this isn't a negotiation, Frank. Either you trust me or you don't. The ranch owner studied her face for a long moment, then stepped back. "You heard her, boys. Give the lady some room." The assembled hands retreated reluctantly, their boots scraping against the dusty ground. Maya waited until the last of them had moved beyond her specified perimeter, before turning her attention fully to Diablo. The stallion had moved closer during the commotion, now standing only 20 feet away. His coat gleamed like polished obsidian, every muscle defined beneath the surface. Maya had worked with difficult horses before, but nothing quite like this. This animal radiated a kind of primal authority that demanded respect. She climbed onto the fence, settling herself on the top rail with practiced ease. Diablo's ears swiveled toward her, tracking the sound of her movements. When she remained still, he took a tentative step forward. "Easy, beautiful," she murmured, her voice barely carrying beyond the corral. "Just want to have a conversation." The stallion snorted, tossing his magnificent head, but he didn't retreat. If anything, he seemed curious about this new human who wasn't immediately trying to dominate him. Maya reached into her jacket pocket and withdrew an apple, holding it loosely in her palm. The sweet scent carried on the morning breeze, and Diablo's nostrils flared again. He took another step forward, then stopped, clearly torn between desire and caution. "I know what they've been trying to do to you," Maya continued, her tone conversational. "All those ropes and whips and shouting. Must get old, having people assume you're nothing but an animal to be conquered." Diablo's ears twitched at the sound of her voice. There was something almost human in his expression, a weariness that Maya recognized all too well. They'd both been running from something, she realized. The difference was that she'd had a choice about when to stop. She tossed the apple gently toward the center of the corral, far enough away that the stallion wouldn't feel trapped if he approached it. Diablo eyed the fruit warily, then looked back at her. When Maya made no move to climb down from the fence, he walked over and investigated the offering. The apple disappeared in 2 powerful bites, juice staining his muzzle. When he looked up again, something had shifted in his demeanor. Not trust, that would take much longer, but a recognition that this particular human might be different from the others. "That's a start," Maya said softly. She remained on the fence for another hour, speaking occasionally but mostly just existing in the same space as the magnificent animal. Diablo gradually grew comfortable enough to graze near the fence, though he never turned his back completely on her. When she finally climbed down, Frank approached with obvious relief. "Well, what do you think?" Maya dusted off her hands, considering the question. The stallion had settled at the far end of the corral again, but his posture was different now, less defensive, more thoughtful. "I think," she said slowly, "that horse has been waiting his whole life for someone to actually see him instead of just trying to use him." Frank frowned. "Meaning what, exactly?" Maya looked back at Diablo, who was watching their conversation with obvious interest. "Meaning this is going to take longer than any of us expected, but it's going to be worth it." The morning sun cast long shadows across the corral as Jake stood at the fence, watching Diablo pace the perimeter like a caged predator. The stallion's obsidian coat gleamed with sweat despite the cool dawn air, his nostrils flaring with each labored breath. 3 days had passed since their first encounter, and the horse remained as volatile as ever. Margaret approached with 2 steaming cups of coffee, her boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. "He hasn't stopped moving all night," she said, handing Jake a cup. "Tom says we should just put him down. Says there's no point in torturing ourselves anymore." Jake took a slow sip, never taking his eyes off the stallion. "Tom's scared. Can't say I blame him." He paused, studying the way Diablo moved, always keeping the maximum distance from any human presence, yet never looking away. "But fear makes for poor decisions. And what about you?" Margaret's voice carried a weight that made Jake glance at her. "Are you scared?" The question hung between them like morning mist. Jake had faced down armed desperados, survived prison riots, and stared death in the face more times than he cared to count. But this horse, this magnificent broken creature, stirred something different in his chest, something that felt dangerously close to recognition. "Yeah," he admitted quietly, "I'm scared of failing him." Margaret studied his profile, noting the way his jaw tightened when he spoke about the horse. "You see yourself in him, don't you?" Jake's hand instinctively moved to his shoulder, where the old gunshot wound still ached in cold weather. "Maybe. Or maybe I just see what happens when the world decides you're too dangerous to exist." A commotion near the ranch house interrupted their conversation. Tom was striding toward them with 3 other men Jake didn't recognize. Their clean clothes and confident swagger marked them as outsiders, probably more so-called experts Margaret had summoned in desperation. "Mrs. Clayton," the lead man called out, tipping his hat. "Name's Harrison. Heard you've got a problem horse that needs sorting." Margaret's face flushed. "I didn't call anyone else." Tom stepped forward, his chest puffed with authority. "I took the liberty. These gentlemen have handled difficult animals all across Colorado and Wyoming. They know how to deal with rogues like this one." Jake watched Harrison and his men approach the corral with the casual arrogance of those who'd never truly been tested. They carried ropes and what looked like a metal contraption designed to restrain the horse's head. "Jesus," Harrison whistled, getting his first look at Diablo. "That's a big son of a bitch. No wonder you've been having trouble." The stallion's reaction was immediate and violent. He reared up, his hooves striking the air as he screamed his defiance. The sound cut through the morning air like a blade, causing Harrison's men to take an involuntary step backward. "We'll need to tranquilize him first," one of the men said, producing a rifle with a dart attachment. "Can't work with an animal in that state?" "No." Jake's voice cut across the group like a whip crack. "You're not drugging him." Harrison turned, noticing Jake for the first time. His eyes took in the worn clothes, the weathered face, the hands scarred from hard living. "And you are?" "Someone who knows better than to break a spirit that's already been broken too many times." "Listen, friend." Harrison's tone carried condescending patience. "I appreciate your concern, but we're professionals. We've handled hundreds of difficult horses." Jake stepped closer, and something in his bearing made the other men shift uncomfortably. "You've handled horses that were difficult. This one's different. This one's been betrayed by every human he's ever trusted. You go in there with your ropes and drugs and metal contraptions, and you will either get yourselves killed or destroy what's left of his soul. So what's your solution?" Tom demanded. "Let him rot in that corral forever?" Jake drained his coffee and handed the empty cup to Margaret. "Give me one more day." "One day to do what?" Harrison laughed. "Talk him into submission? One day to earn something nobody's bothered to try earning yet." Jake climbed over the fence into the corral, ignoring the sharp intake of breath from Margaret. His trust. Diablo immediately charged toward the far end of the enclosure, his massive frame radiating fury and terror in equal measure. But this time, Jake noticed something different. The horse stopped short of slamming into the fence, instead whirling to face him from across the space. Jake stood perfectly still in the center of the corral, his hands at his sides, his breathing slow and deliberate. He didn't speak, didn't move, didn't do anything except exist in the same space as the stallion. Outside the fence, the group watched in tense silence as man and horse engaged in a battle of wills that would determine both their fates. The morning air hung thick with tension as Jake walked toward the corral, his boots crunching against the frost-covered ground. Word had spread through the ranch like wildfire. Today was the day he'd attempt to ride thunder for the first time. Ranch hands clustered along the fence rails, their breath visible in white puffs as they whispered among themselves. Elena stood beside the gate, her face a mask of controlled worry. She'd barely slept, knowing what this moment meant. Either Jake would succeed where dozens of experts had failed, or thunder would break him like all the others. The difference was, she'd grown to care about this particular outcome more than she wanted to admit. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly as Jake approached. He paused, studying her face. Over the past weeks, Something had shifted between them. The walls he'd built around himself had begun to crack, and she'd seen glimpses of the man beneath the legend. "Yeah, I do," he replied. "We both know why." Thunder stood in the center of the corral, magnificent and deadly. The stallion's black coat gleamed like obsidian, muscles rippling beneath as he paced. His eyes tracked Jake's every movement, intelligent and calculating. This wasn't just a wild horse, this was a creature that had learned to hate everything about human contact. Jake slipped through the gate, and the murmur of voices died instantly. The only sounds were the soft whisper of wind through the grass and Thunder's rhythmic breathing. The horse stopped pacing, facing Jake directly. For a long moment, neither moved. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, his voice barely audible. He'd left his usual rope behind today. No tools, no tricks, just him and 1,500 pounds of untamed fury. Thunder's ears flattened against his skull, a warning that had preceded attacks on every previous trainer. But Jake didn't retreat. Instead, he began moving in a slow circle around the corral's perimeter, never looking directly at the horse, never approaching. To the watching crowd, it looked like nothing. To Thunder, it was something entirely new. Minutes stretched into an hour. Jake continued his patient circuit, occasionally stopping to lean against the fence or examine his boots. He was showing Thunder something no trainer had ever demonstrated, that a human could be in the same space without demanding anything. Elena found herself holding her breath as Thunder's posture gradually changed. The stallion's ears lifted slightly, his head turning to track Jake's movement with curiosity rather than rage. "What's he doing?" whispered Maria, the cook, who'd abandoned her kitchen to watch. "Being smarter than the rest of us," Elena replied. Jake began to hum, a low, wordless tune that seemed to flow with the wind. Thunder's ears swiveled toward the sound. The horse took a tentative step closer to the fence, then another. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, Thunder was choosing to approach a human. When Jake finally turned to face the stallion directly, the change in atmosphere was palpable. Thunder didn't rear or charge. Instead, he stood perfectly still, every muscle coiled but controlled. The two studied each other across 20 feet of dusty ground. "That's it," Jake said softly. "We understand each other, don't we?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out an apple, taking a deliberate bite before tossing the rest onto the ground between them. Thunder's nostrils flared, catching the scent, but he didn't move toward it. Trust would take more than food. Jake resumed his circling, this time gradually tightening the radius. Thunder pivoted to keep him in sight, but showed no signs of aggression. When Jake was close enough to touch the fence rails the horse had been leaning against, he stopped. "You've been hurt," he said conversationally, as if speaking to an old friend. "Someone tried to break you instead of understand you. I know how that feels." Thunder's response was subtle but unmistakable. His head lowered slightly, the universal equine gesture of relaxation. Elena felt tears prick her eyes. In 2 hours, Jake had accomplished what months of professional training had failed to achieve. But the real test came when Jake slowly extended his hand. Thunder's entire body tensed, memories of rough handling flooding back. Jake waited, hand outstretched but not reaching. The choice had to be Thunder's. The stallion took one careful step forward, then another. His muzzle barely touched Jake's fingertips before he pulled back, but it was enough. Contact had been made. "Good boy," Jake breathed. "That's enough for today." He began backing away slowly, maintaining eye contact until he reached the gate. Thunder watched him go without moving, a statue carved from midnight. As Jake stepped outside the corral, the assembled crowd erupted in amazed chatter. But Elena only had eyes for the man who'd just performed a miracle through patience and understanding rather than force. "How did you know?" she asked. Jake glanced back at Thunder, who was finally approaching the discarded apple. "Sometimes the wildest things just need someone to prove they're not all monsters," he said quietly. "Horses and men alike." The morning air hung thick with dust and tension as Jake approached the corral. Thunder stood at the far end, muscles rippling beneath his midnight coat, eyes fixed on the man who had dared to ride him twice now. The stallion's breathing came in steady puffs through flared nostrils, and Jake could see the intelligence burning there, not the wild, unfocused rage of before, but something sharper, more calculating. "He's been waiting for you," Sarah said softly from behind the fence rails. "Been standing there since dawn, just watching the house." Jake nodded, never taking his eyes off Thunder. The horse's behavior had shifted after yesterday's ride. Where once there had been pure hostility, now there was something else, curiosity perhaps, or the beginning of respect. It was the kind of change Jake had seen in difficult horses before, but never one this powerful, this willful. "Today we find out what you're really made of," Jake murmured, slipping between the rails. Thunder's ears pricked forward, tracking every movement. The stallion didn't retreat this time, didn't lower his head in preparation for a charge. Instead, he stood his ground, waiting. Jake could feel the weight of watching eyes. Sarah, Miguel, and several ranch hands had gathered to witness what they all sensed would be a pivotal moment. Jake moved closer, his steps measured and deliberate. When he reached the center of the corral, he stopped and simply stood there, letting Thunder make the next choice. Minutes passed. The stallion's head tilted slightly, as if puzzling over this strange human who refused to be predictable. Then, to everyone's amazement, Thunder took a step forward. "Jesus," one of the hands whispered. "He's never done that before." Jake remained motionless as Thunder approached, each step deliberate and cautious. The stallion's massive frame cast a shadow over Jake, but there was no menace in it now, only a careful, testing energy. Thunder stopped just within arm's reach, close enough that Jake could feel the heat radiating from the horse's body. Very slowly, Jake raised his hand. Thunder's eyes tracked the movement, muscles tensing beneath his coat, ready to bolt or strike. But when Jake's palm came to rest against the stallion's neck, Thunder held steady. The contact sent a jolt through both of them, a moment of connection that transcended the barriers between species, between rebel spirits, recognizing something kindred in each other. "That's it," Jake whispered. "We're going to figure this out together." For the next hour, Jake worked with Thunder in ways the watching crowd had never seen. No ropes, no harsh words, no attempts at dominance. Instead, he moved around the horse like a dance partner, reading every twitch of muscle, every shift in breathing. When Thunder grew tense, Jake backed away. When the stallion showed curiosity, Jake rewarded it with gentle touch or soft words. The breakthrough came when Jake began to mimic some of Thunder's movements. When the stallion pawed the ground, Jake shuffled his feet in response. When Thunder tossed his head, Jake nodded back. It was a conversation conducted in body language, and slowly Thunder began to understand that this human was trying to speak his language. By midday, Jake was able to run his hands along Thunder's flanks, down his legs, even lift his hooves briefly. Each small victory built upon the last, creating a foundation of trust that had been absent in every previous attempt to work with the horse. "I'll be damned," Miguel said, shaking his head in wonder. "In 30 years of working horses, I ain't never seen anything like it." But Jake knew they were still walking a tightrope. Thunder's cooperation was tentative, conditional. One wrong move, one moment of inattention, and all this progress could vanish. The stallion was testing him constantly, probing for weaknesses, for any sign that Jake might revert to the harsh methods other trainers had used. As the afternoon wore on, Jake introduced the saddle blanket again. This time, instead of the explosive reaction from days before, Thunder only sidestepped nervously. Jake let him smell the blanket, rub his face against it, until it became familiar rather than threatening. "Easy boy," Jake murmured, draping the blanket across Thunder's back. "Just getting acquainted." Thunder's skin twitched and rippled, but he didn't buck. His dark eyes rolled back to watch Jake, alert but not panicked. It was progress, real, measurable progress. Sarah climbed down from the fence and approached cautiously. "He's actually letting you—" Thunder's head snapped toward her, ears pinning back slightly. Jake immediately stepped between them, his hand finding the stallion's neck. "Not yet," he told Sarah quietly. "He's still deciding about me. Adding anyone else to the equation right now would be pushing too hard." Sarah nodded and backed away, but Jake could see the hope in her eyes. For the first time since Thunder had arrived at the ranch, someone was making genuine headway with the impossible horse. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, Jake removed the blanket and stepped back. Thunder stood calmly, no longer the furious beast that had terrorized every person who'd entered this corral. Tomorrow would bring the real test, the saddle itself. The morning sun cast long shadows across the corral as Jake approached Thunder's pen with deliberate, measured steps. 3 weeks had passed since their first encounter, and the stallion no longer reared and struck at his approach. Progress, but fragile as spun glass. Sarah watched from the porch, coffee growing cold in her hands. She'd barely slept, haunted by dreams of her father's voice echoing through the ranch house, warning her about trusting drifters with dark pasts. But watching Jake work with Thunder had shown her something she'd never seen before, the horse responding to human contact without violence. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, sliding between the fence rails. Thunder stood at the far end of the pen, muscles tense but ears forward. The stallion's coat gleamed like polished obsidian in the early light, magnificent and untamed despite weeks of careful handling. Jake had spent hours simply sitting in the pen, never approaching, just existing in Thunder's space until the horse grew accustomed to his presence. Yesterday, Thunder had allowed him to come within arm's reach. Today would test whether that trust held. From the barn, Miguel emerged leading a saddled mare. The sight of the tack made Thunder snort and stamp, memories of brutal training sessions flooding back. Jake raised his hand without looking away from the stallion. "Not yet," he called softly. "Put her back." Miguel nodded and retreated. The old vaquero had watched Jake's methods with growing respect, recognizing something the younger ranch hands missed. Patience learned through hard experience, the kind that came from understanding what it meant to be broken. Thunder's breathing slowed as the mare disappeared. Jake took another step forward, hand extended, fingers slightly curved. The stallion's nostrils flared, testing the air, reading intentions in scent and posture. "I know what they did to you," Jake whispered. "I know how it feels when trust becomes a weapon used against you." The words seemed to resonate. Thunder's ears swiveled forward, and for the first time since Jake had arrived, the stallion took a voluntary step toward him. Then another. The space between them diminished until Jake could feel the warmth radiating from the horse's massive frame. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. No one had gotten this close to Thunder without ropes or barriers since the day they'd bought him. Jake's fingers brushed Thunder's muzzle, feather-light contact that made the stallion tremble but not pull away. The touch lasted only seconds before Jake withdrew, respecting the boundary while acknowledging the breakthrough. "That's enough for today," he said, backing away slowly. As Jake climbed from the pen, Sheriff Morrison's dusty patrol car rolled up the drive. Sarah's stomach clenched. She'd been dreading this moment, knowing it would come eventually. Morrison climbed out, his weathered face grim. Behind him, 2 men in expensive suits emerged from a black sedan. Federal agents, their bearing unmistakable. "Miss Garrett," Morrison said, touching his hat brim, "I'm afraid we need to talk to Jake." Jake had seen them coming. He leaned against the corral fence with studied casualness, but Sarah noticed his hands positioned for quick movement, old instinct surfacing. "Jake Morrison," the elder agent said, stepping forward. "Agent Crawford, FBI. We need you to come with us." "What's this about?" Sarah demanded, moving to stand beside Jake. Crawford's expression remained neutral. "Mr. Morrison is wanted for questioning in connection with a bank robbery in Nevada. 3 men fitting his description hit a Wells Fargo branch 6 months ago." "That's impossible," Sarah said. "Jake's been here for weeks. The robbery was 6 months ago, ma'am. Before he arrived." Jake's jaw tightened. "I told you my past would catch up eventually." "You said you were done with that life," Sarah shot back. "I am." His voice carried quiet conviction. "But that doesn't erase what came before." Thunder sensed the tension, beginning to pace within his pen, muscles bunching with renewed agitation. The progress they'd made hung in the balance. "I'll go with you," Jake said to Crawford, "but I need 1 day to finish what I started here." "That's not how this works," the agent replied. "1 day," Sarah interrupted. "That horse has been a danger to everyone on this ranch for months. Jake's the first person to make real progress. Give him 1 day to make sure Thunder doesn't hurt someone when he's gone." Crawford studied the stallion, noting the animal's increasing agitation as tension mounted among the humans. Professional calculation flickered in his eyes. 12 hours, he said finally. "Sheriff Morrison will supervise. Then you come with us, no resistance." Jake nodded. 12 hours. As the agents retreated to their car to wait, Jake turned back to Thunder's pen. The stallion stood pressed against the far fence, wild-eyed and trembling, the morning's breakthrough already crumbling. "Looks like we're both running out of time, boy," Jake murmured. The morning sun cast long shadows across the corral as Jake stood motionless, his weathered hands resting on the fence rail. Thunder paced the perimeter like a caged predator, muscles rippling beneath his midnight coat. 3 weeks had passed since their first encounter, and the stallion's fury had evolved into something more complex, a simmering challenge that crackled between them whenever their eyes met. "He's testing you," Sarah observed, joining Jake at the fence. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, testament to sleepless nights worrying about the ranch's mounting debts. "Every day, watching you, waiting for something." Jake nodded, never taking his gaze off Thunder. The horse had stopped pacing and now stood at the far end of the corral, head raised, nostrils flaring as he caught their scent. "He's not just wild anymore, he's thinking. That makes him more dangerous." "The bank called again," Sarah said quietly. "They want an answer by Friday." The weight of those words settled between them like dust after a stampede. Friday was 3 days away, and Thunder remained as untouchable as the day Jake arrived. Every approach had been met with violent resistance, hooves striking air like lightning, teeth bared in primal defiance. The stallion had learned Jake's patterns, anticipating every move with the cunning of a seasoned fighter. "Maybe we should consider Peterson's offer," Sarah continued, though her voice carried no conviction. "At least you'd walk away with something." Jake's jaw tightened. Peterson's offer was highway robbery, a fraction of what the ranch was worth, contingent on Thunder being destroyed. The thought of that magnificent creature meeting such an end made something cold and hard settle in his chest. "No," he said simply. Thunder suddenly bolted toward the fence where they stood, stopping just short of the rails with a snort that sent vapor clouds into the crisp air. His dark eyes locked onto Jake's, and for a moment something passed between them, not submission, but recognition. Two creatures who had known violence and chose to stand alone rather than trust. "He reminds me of someone I used to know," Jake murmured, more to himself than Sarah. "Someone who fought the world, because he was afraid it would break him first." Sarah studied Jake's profile, noting the way his scars caught the light, the tension that never quite left his shoulders. What happened to him? He learned that sometimes the thing you're fighting hardest is yourself. Without another word, Jake climbed the fence and dropped into the corral. Sarah's sharp intake of breath was audible, but he didn't turn back. Thunder's head shot up, ears pinned back as Jake walked slowly toward the center of the enclosure. But instead of charging, the stallion held his ground, muscles coiled like springs, ready to explode into motion. Jake stopped 20 feet away and sat down in the dirt, cross-legged, hands resting on his knees. The gesture was so unexpected that Thunder actually took a step back, confusion replacing aggression in his dark eyes. "I know what it's like," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying across the space between them. "Being hurt so bad you can't tell the difference between help and harm anymore." Thunder's ears twitched forward slightly, then back again. He pawed the ground nervously, but didn't retreat further. "I spent 15 years running from ghosts," Jake continued, his tone conversational despite the danger. "Thought if I stayed angry enough, stayed moving enough, they couldn't catch up. but they always did, because I was carrying them with me. The stallion took a tentative step forward, then another, drawn by something in Jake's voice that seemed to resonate with his own wounded spirit. Sarah watched from the fence, barely breathing, as the distance between man and horse slowly decreased. "The thing about walls," Jake said, never breaking eye contact with Thunder, "is they keep things in as much as they keep things out. All that rage, all that pain, it's got nowhere to go." Thunder was 10 feet away now, close enough that Jake could see the old scars crossing his hide like a map of betrayal. Someone had hurt this animal badly, systematically, until trust became a luxury he couldn't afford. "But you don't have to carry it alone anymore," Jake whispered. For a heartbeat, Thunder stood frozen, every instinct warring between flight and something deeper, a desperate hunger for connection that he'd buried beneath layers of protective fury. Then, slowly, impossibly, he lowered his head. Jake remained perfectly still as the stallion's muzzle moved toward his outstretched hand. The warm breath across his palm sent electricity up his arm. One wrong move, one sudden gesture, and those teeth could take his fingers clean off. But Thunder didn't bite. Instead, he rested his great head against Jake's palm for exactly 3 seconds before jerking away and trotting to the far side of the corral. The message was clear: "I see you, but I'm not ready." Jake smiled for the first time in weeks. Progress wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it was measured in heartbeats, in the space between fear and faith. The morning sun cast long shadows across the corral as Jake stood motionless, his weathered hands gripping the fence rails. Thunder paced the perimeter like a caged storm, his black coat gleaming with sweat, despite the early hour. 3 days had passed since their last encounter, and the stallion's restless energy seemed to have only intensified. "He's been like this all night," Maria said, approaching with 2 steaming cups of coffee. Barely stopped moving. Jake accepted the cup gratefully, the warmth seeping through his fingers. "He's fighting something inside himself, same as I was." The admission hung in the air between them. Over the past weeks, Maria had watched Jake transform from the hollow-eyed drifter who'd arrived at her ranch into something approaching the man he used to be. But she could see the battle wasn't over, not for him, and certainly not for Thunder. "Your father called again," she said quietly. "Left another message." Jake's jaw tightened. Samuel Cross had been persistent since learning of his son's whereabouts, his voice on the answering machine, a mixture of authority and barely concealed desperation. The old man wanted reconciliation, but Jake wasn't ready for that conversation. Not yet. What did he say? That he's proud of what you're doing here, that he was wrong to push you away after... She stopped herself, reading the warning in Jake's expression. Thunder suddenly wheeled toward them, his ears pricked forward as if sensing the tension. For a moment, horse and man stared at each other across the dusty arena, 2 wounded souls recognizing something familiar in the other's pain. "I need to go in there," Jake said. "Jake, no. He's too agitated." But Jake was already moving, slipping through the gate with fluid grace. Thunder snorted and backed away, his hooves striking sparks against the hard-packed earth. The stallion's eyes rolled white, showing the fear that lived beneath all that fury. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know what it's like to carry all that rage, to let it eat you alive from the inside." He took a step forward, and Thunder responded with a half-rear front hooves pawing the air in warning. But Jake didn't retreat. Instead, he began to speak in the same low, steady tone that had once calmed spooked cattle during midnight storms. "You know what I figured out? All that anger, all that fighting, it's just fear wearing a different face. Fear of being hurt again. Fear of trusting someone who might let you down." Thunder's ears flicked forward, his posture shifting almost imperceptibly. Jake took another careful step. "My brother used to say that the strongest horses weren't the ones who never fell, but the ones who learned to get back up. Took me a long time to understand what he meant." The mention of Tommy sent a familiar ache through Jake's chest. But this time he didn't push it away. Instead, he let the memory wash over him. Tommy's laugh, his fearless way with animals, the light in his eyes that had dimmed and finally disappeared in that hospital bed. "He would have known what to do with you," Jake continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Would have seen right through all this bluster to the scared colt underneath." Thunder stopped pacing. His nostrils flared as he tested the air, sensing the change in the man before him. Jake's defenses were down, his carefully constructed walls crumbling like adobe in a rainstorm. "I couldn't save him," Jake whispered, the words torn from somewhere deep inside. "My little brother, and I couldn't do a damn thing to help him, so I ran. Figured if I couldn't save the people I loved, what was the point of sticking around?" The stallion took a tentative step forward, drawn by the raw honesty in Jake's voice. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, Thunder approached without aggression, without the wild fury that had defined him. Jake extended his hand slowly, palm up. "But running doesn't fix anything, does it? Just makes the hurt grow bigger until it's all you can see." Thunder stretched his neck forward, his velvet muzzle nearly touching Jake's fingers. The moment hung suspended between them, fragile as spun glass. Jake Maria's voice carried a note of warning. Both man and horse turned toward the gate, where Maria stood pointing toward the ranch road. A cloud of dust marked an approaching vehicle, a sleek black truck that looked out of place among the weathered ranch equipment. Thunder spooked at the interruption, wheeling away with a sharp whinny. The spell was broken, but something fundamental had shifted. Jake could feel it in the way the stallion looked at him now, with wariness instead of outright hostility. The truck pulled up beside the corral, and Jake's blood ran cold as he recognized the driver. Vincent Caruso stepped out, his expensive boots crunching on the gravel, his predator's smile intact despite the early hour. "Hello, Jake," Caruso called out, his voice carrying easily across the morning air. "We need to talk." The morning sun cast long shadows across the corral as Jake approached Diablo for what he knew could be their final encounter. 3 weeks of careful work had led to this moment. The stallion standing calm but alert, his dark eyes following Jake's every movement. The horse no longer pinned his ears back or struck out with his hooves when Jake entered the pen, but the wildness still burned beneath the surface like banked coals ready to ignite. Sarah watched from the fence rail, her knuckles white as she gripped the weathered wood. The past few days had been a revelation, seeing Jake work with a patience she never knew he possessed. Gone was the reckless young man who'd left town in disgrace 15 years ago. In his place stood someone who moved with deliberate purpose, every gesture calculated to build trust rather than assert dominance. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, extending his hand palm up. Diablo's nostrils flared, taking in Jake's scent. The stallion had learned to associate this particular human with grain, fresh water, and gentle words rather than whips and harsh commands. But today would test whether that fragile bond could withstand the ultimate challenge. Jake had seen horses like Diablo before, magnificent creatures broken by men who mistook brutality for strength. In a federal prison in Nevada, he'd worked with the Wild Mustang Rehabilitation Program, learning that some spirits couldn't be shattered, only channeled. The irony wasn't lost on him that both he and this horse had spent years behind barriers, their wildness seen as something to be eliminated rather than understood. "You're not the monster they painted you to be, are you?" Jake said softly, running his fingers along Diablo's neck. The stallion's muscles twitched, but he didn't pull away. "Just like I wasn't the lost cause everyone figured I was." Tom Henderson stood near the barn, his weathered face etched with worry. The bank's deadline loomed tomorrow, and every day Diablo remained untrained was another day closer to financial ruin. He'd watched Jake's unconventional methods with growing hope, but seeing progress and achieving a rideable horse were two different things entirely. Jake reached for the saddle blanket he'd left draped over the fence. For the past week, he'd been introducing Diablo to the feel of fabric on his back, starting with nothing more than his jacket. Each day, the weight had increased slightly. The stallion had accepted the blanket yesterday, though his eyes had rolled white with ancestral memory of what came next. "We're going to take this real slow," Jake said, more to himself than the horse. He'd learned the hard way that rushing led to disaster. In his youth, he'd been all fury and impatience, demanding the world bend to his will. Prison had taught him that some victories could only be won through surrender, not giving up, but letting go of the need to dominate. Diablo stood statue still as Jake placed the blanket across his back. The stallion's breathing quickened, but his hooves remained planted. Jake waited, counting heartbeats, feeling the tension in the air like electricity before a storm. When Diablo's breathing steadied, Jake reached for the saddle. This was the moment that had defeated every other trainer. The saddle represented complete submission to human will, and Diablo had violently rejected it every time. Jake had watched the videos, seen the explosive fury that erupted whenever leather touched the stallion's back. But those trainers had approached the task like conquering generals. Jake intended to be a diplomat. The saddle settled onto Diablo's back with barely a whisper of sound. The stallion's entire body went rigid, every muscle coiled like a spring. Jake kept his hand on the horse's neck, feeling the tremor that ran through the powerful frame. This was the precipice. One wrong move, and 3 weeks of progress would explode into chaos. "I know what it's like," Jake whispered, "having something forced on you, feeling trapped with no way out. But sometimes we can choose a different kind of freedom." Minutes passed with neither man nor horse moving. Sarah held her breath, afraid that even the sound might shatter the delicate moment. Tom found himself praying to a god he'd barely spoken to since his wife's death, bargaining for just this one miracle. Slowly, Jake reached for the cinch strap. Diablo's head turned, one dark eye fixed on Jake's movements. The stallion could crush him with a single kick, could rear up and strike with hooves sharp as razors. Instead, he stood trembling but trusting as Jake secured the saddle with hands that had once known only how to take what they wanted. When the last buckle clicked into place, Jake stepped back. Diablo remained motionless for several heartbeats, then took a tentative step forward, then another. The saddle stayed in place, foreign but not painful, confining but not cruel. Jake reached for the bridle, the final piece of the puzzle that would determine whether tomorrow brought salvation or surrender. The morning sun cast long shadows across the corral as Jake approached Thunder with measured steps. 3 weeks had passed since their first encounter, and the stallion no longer reared at his presence, though his eyes still held that wild fire that could never be fully extinguished. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, extending his weathered hand toward the magnificent black horse. Thunder's nostrils flared, testing the air between them, before he grudgingly allowed the touch against his neck. The contact sent electricity through both man and beast, a connection forged through patience, respect, and shared stubbornness. Sarah watched from the fence, her knuckles white as she gripped the wooden rail. Every morning for 3 weeks she'd stood in this exact spot, witnessing something she'd thought impossible. The horse that had sent 6 trainers to the hospital was now accepting a saddle blanket across his back without so much as a snort of protest. "I still can't believe it," she whispered to her foreman, Marcus, who stood beside her with his hat pulled low against the glare. "That man's got magic in him," Marcus replied, though his voice carried a note of unease. "Question is, what kind?" Jake had never explained his methods, and Sarah had learned not to ask. There was something in his eyes when he worked with Thunder, a darkness that matched the stallion's own untamed spirit. She'd seen that look once before, in her father's eyes when he spoke of the war. It was the look of a man who'd stared into the abyss and found something staring back. Thunder shifted restlessly as Jake lifted the saddle, his muscles tensing beneath his midnight coat. For a moment, Sarah held her breath, remembering the last trainer who'd attempted this. The man had spent 2 months in a wheelchair, his ribs still aching when storms rolled through. "Not yet, Thunder," Jake said softly, lowering the saddle. "We go at your pace, remember?" The words seemed to calm the stallion, though Sarah noticed Jake's hand remained steady near the rope coiled at his belt. There was something almost ritualistic about the way he moved, each gesture deliberate and precise. She'd begun to suspect this wasn't just about breaking horses. This was about something deeper, something personal between two creatures who understood what it meant to be dangerous. A cloud of dust on the horizon caught Marcus's attention. "Someone's coming," he announced, squinting against the sun. "Coming fast." Sarah shielded her eyes and felt her stomach drop. The black sedan kicking up dust along the ranch road was government issue. She'd seen enough of them during the cattle inspections to recognize the type. But this wasn't about cattle. Jake must have heard the engine too, because thunder suddenly tensed beneath his hands, feeding off the man's shifting energy. The stallion's ears flattened against his skull, and that old wildness flickered back into his eyes like flames catching dry tinder. "Easy," Jake murmured, but his voice had changed. The gentle patience was still there, but underneath it lurked something harder, colder. His free hand drifted toward his jacket pocket, a movement so subtle Sarah almost missed it. The sedan pulled to a stop near the main house, and two men in dark suits emerged. They moved with the practiced efficiency of federal agents, their eyes scanning the property with professional detachment. The driver remained behind the wheel, engine running. "Jake Morrison," the taller agent called across the yard, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Jake's hand stilled on Thunder's neck, and the stallion seemed to sense the change in him. The horse's muscles coiled like springs, ready to explode into motion. For a moment, Sarah thought Thunder might bolt, but instead he stepped closer to Jake, as if offering protection to the man who'd shown him kindness. "Depends who's asking," Jake replied without turning around. His voice was steady, but Sarah caught the steel beneath it. The agent approached the corral slowly, his partner flanking left with practiced precision. "Agent Collins, FBI. We need to talk." Sarah felt the world tilt slightly. FBI. She'd invited a wanted man onto her ranch, and now that past was catching up to both of them. The cattle, the mortgage, the ranch. Suddenly it all seemed insignificant compared to whatever was about to unfold. Thunder snorted and pawed the ground, his wild instinct screaming danger. Jake's hand moved in slow circles against the stallion's neck, a gesture that seemed to calm them both. "Sarah," Jake said quietly, still not turning around. "Take Marcus and go inside." "Jake, now." The word carried finality and something else, regret perhaps, or goodbye. As Sarah reluctantly backed away from the fence, she watched Jake straighten his shoulders and finally turned to face the agents. Thunder remained at his side, no longer the terrified, violent creature she'd first encountered, but something far more dangerous. A wild animal that had chosen its loyalty and would fight to protect it. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the shadows and leaving nowhere left to hide. The morning sun cast long shadows across the corral as Jake stood at the fence, his weathered hands gripping the top rail. 3 weeks had passed since he'd first laid eyes on Diablo, and the black stallion had tested every ounce of patience and skill he possessed. But something had shifted between them yesterday, a moment of understanding that felt as fragile as spun glass. Sarah approached with 2 steaming cups of coffee, her boots crunching softly on the frost-covered ground. "You've been out here since dawn," she said, offering him a cup. Jake accepted it gratefully, the warmth seeping through his fingers. "He's different today. Can you see it?" In the center of the corral, Diablo stood motionless, his magnificent head turned toward them. The rage that had once burned in his dark eyes had cooled to something else. Wariness, mixed with what Jake dared to hope was curiosity. "He's not pacing," Sarah observed. "That's new." For weeks, the stallion had worn a path around the perimeter of the enclosure, his hooves pounding out a rhythm of fury and desperation. Now he stood still, watching Jake with an intensity that made the hair on the back of the trainer's neck stand up. "I'm going in," Jake said quietly. Sarah's hand found his arm. "Jake, be careful. He nearly killed you last time." The bruises along Jake's ribs had only just begun to fade, souvenirs from Diablo's powerful hooves when the horse had cornered him against the fence. But Jake had seen something in that moment of violence. Beneath the stallion's fury lay a pain that mirrored his own. Jake climbed over the fence and dropped into the corral, his movements slow and deliberate. Diablo's ears flicked forward, then back, his muscles coiling with tension. But he didn't charge. He didn't rear or strike. He simply watched. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, taking a step forward. "I know what it's like to be caged by your own anger." The stallion snorted, pawing the ground once, but held his position. Jake could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the eyes of the ranch hands who had gathered at a safe distance to witness what they were certain would be another disaster. Another step, then another. Jake kept his hands visible, his posture non-threatening, even as every instinct screamed at him to be ready to run or fight. He'd learned to read horses the way other men read books, and what he saw in Diablo now wasn't the blind rage of a killer. It was the desperate confusion of a creature that had forgotten how to trust. "You and me, we're not so different," Jake continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Both of us been hurt. Both of us learned that the world's safer when you keep everyone at a distance." 20 feet separated them now. Diablo's nostrils flared, scenting the air. His tail swished once, a sign of agitation, but he remained still. Jake thought of his own journey, the years of running from his past, the walls he'd built around his heart, the way he'd pushed away anyone who tried to get close. He saw that same isolation in the stallion's eyes, that same bone-deep loneliness that came from being misunderstood. "But being alone ain't living," Jake said, taking another careful step. "It's just surviving, and that's no way for a spirit like yours to exist." 15 feet. Diablo's breathing deepened, his chest rising and falling like a great bellows. One ear swiveled toward Jake, while the other remained alert to everything else around them. Jake stopped moving forward and instead sank slowly to his knees in the dirt, making himself smaller, less threatening. It was a gesture of vulnerability that went against every survival instinct he possessed. But sometimes trust required sacrifice. "I see you," he said simply. "Not the monster everyone thinks you are. I see the horse you used to be before the world taught you that kindness was weakness." For a long moment, neither moved. The morning breeze stirred the dust between them, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. Then, impossibly, Diablo took a step forward. Jake's breath caught in his throat. The stallion moved with liquid grace, his powerful frame rippling with each careful step. Another step, then another, until Jake could see every detail of the horse's magnificent face. The fine lines around his eyes, the small scar above his left nostril, the way his nostrils quivered with each breath. Diablo stopped just out of reach, his great head lowered slightly, studying this strange man who knelt in the dirt before him. Jake remained perfectly still, letting the horse take his time, letting him decide. Then, with infinite care, Diablo stretched his neck forward and touched his velvet muzzle to Jake's outstretched hand. The contact lasted only a heartbeat before the stallion pulled back, but it was enough. In that brief touch, Jake felt something break open inside both of them, a crack in the armor they'd both worn for so long. The morning sun cast long shadows across the corral as Jake adjusted his worn leather gloves one final time. Thunder stood in the center of the ring, muscles rippling beneath his midnight coat, steam rising from his nostrils in the cool air. The stallion's eyes held that familiar fire, but something had shifted in the weeks they'd spent together. The raw hatred had transformed into something else, respect perhaps, or at least acknowledgement of a worthy adversary. Sarah Mitchell stood at the fence beside her father, watching as Jake approached the horse with measured steps. The entire ranch had gathered to witness what many believed would be Thunder's final test. If he could accept a rider today without violence, the stallion might finally find his place among the living rather than remaining a beautiful, dangerous force of nature. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, extending his hand. Thunder's ears flicked forward, then back, his powerful frame coiled like a spring. But he didn't retreat. Days of patient groundwork had built this fragile trust, and Jake knew one wrong move could shatter it forever. The stallion allowed Jake's touch on his neck, then his shoulder. Each contact was a small victory hard won through countless hours of understanding rather than dominance. Jake had learned to read Thunder's moods, to recognize the difference between fear-driven aggression and the stallion's natural spirited nature. "He's calmer than I've ever seen him," Sarah whispered to her father, though her knuckles were white where she gripped the fence rail. Jake reached for the blanket folded over the fence, moving with deliberate slowness. Thunder's muscles tensed, but he stood his ground as the soft wool settled across his back. The stallion turned his head, fixing Jake with one dark eye that seemed to ask, "And now what, cowboy?" The saddle came next. Jake had chosen the lightest one in the tack room, worn leather that had seen decades of use but still held strong. Thunder's breathing quickened as the familiar weight settled on his back, but instead of the explosive reaction everyone expected, the stallion simply danced sideways, testing the feel of it. "That's my boy," Jake said softly, securing the cinch with gentle hands. "We're partners now, remember? No more fighting." Around the corral, ranch hands held their breath. They'd all seen Thunder destroy 3 saddles, send 2 trainers to the hospital, and kick a hole clean through the barn wall. This calm acceptance seemed almost supernatural. Jake gathered the reins, his heart hammering against his ribs. This moment would define everything, not just Thunder's future, but his own. He'd come to this ranch running from his past, seeking redemption in the challenge of an impossible horse. Now, looking into Thunder's intelligent eyes, he realized the stallion had been seeking the same thing. With fluid motion, Jake swung into the saddle. Thunder's entire body went rigid, every muscle locked in place. For 5 heartbeats, neither man nor horse moved. Then Thunder took a single, careful step forward. The crowd released a collective breath, but Jake remained focused entirely on the animal beneath him. He could feel Thunder's power, barely contained, like sitting astride a bolt of lightning that might strike at any moment. But the stallion continued walking, his gait smooth and controlled. "Walk on," Jake urged gently, applying the slightest pressure with his heels. Thunder responded, moving into a ground-covering walk that showcased his natural grace. Around the corral they went, horse and rider finding their rhythm together. Sarah felt tears sting her eyes as she watched the scene she'd never dared hope to see. Her father placed a weathered hand on her shoulder, his own emotions barely in check. Thunder, their beautiful broken Thunder, was finally allowing himself to trust again. Jake felt the exact moment when Thunder's last resistance melted away. The stallion's stride lengthened, his neck arched with pride rather than defiance. They moved as one entity now, predator and predator, rebel and rebel, finding peace in their shared understanding of what it meant to be wild and free, yet choosing partnership. As they completed their circuit of the corral, Jake brought Thunder to a halt near the gate. The stallion stood quietly, sides heaving slightly but expression calm. Jake dismounted slowly, keeping one hand on Thunder's neck. "Good boy," he said simply, but the words carried the weight of everything they'd been through together. Tom Mitchell opened the gate, his lined face creased with wonder. "I don't believe it," he said. "After all this time?" Jake removed the saddle and blanket, rubbing Thunder's back where they'd rested. The stallion turned and nuzzled Jake's shoulder, not demanding or aggressive, but gentle, almost grateful. "He'll never be just another ranch horse," Jake said, meeting Sarah's eyes across the corral. "But he doesn't need to be. Some spirits aren't meant to be broken, just understood." Thunder whinnied softly, as if agreeing, and wandered toward the water trough with the casual confidence of a horse finally at home.